All right, y'all, this is a summary of the lesson that we did in biodiversity in case you are just joining me in this lesson or need it for review. Don't forget, this lesson was brought to you by Dr. Jaime Gongora, who is a wildlife geneticist, which is a type of biologist who helped as many as 14,000 ex-combatants or people who opposed the Colombian government until they reached a peace agreement in 2016. He had an idea to work with the UK, United Kingdom, the Colombian, and the Australian governments to establish research groups for these individuals that had previously basically been living in the forest and have now discovered 100 new species of plants and animals just based off of these individuals' knowledge. Colombia, I did not know this, is the second most biodiverse country in the world. There are more bird, amphibian, butterfly, and frog species there than anywhere in the world. Colombia is at the top of South America, just south of Central America, and I really didn't realize just how dense the forests are there, and how one person can make such a big positive change by seeing a change and getting people to work together. Very inspiring. Then we continued our work in biodiversity, where we need to describe the role of biodiversity in ecosystems, as well as classify the organisms into the six kingdoms. Remember, we did some work looking at the ecosystem, then all the different organisms. Now we're getting ready to use all this information next week for looking at populations, all part of our ecology unit. Then in our what's that visual, we needed to count how many different species we could see in this African savanna biome. And I didn't mean just the animals, I also meant the plants. So I'm not exactly sure. We can call those ox, rhino, antelope, or gazelle. I get the two mixed up. Zebra, elephant, lion, at least two different kinds of grass, probably this shrub in the background. So there's a good at least 8 or 9 different species just represented in this ecosystem. And we need every single one of those different kinds of organisms because they are all interconnected, and that is our job in this lesson to describe. But first, before we begin kingdom classification, we need to become code breakers. There are 3 rules for code breaking. First, we need to see if organisms, living things, are made up of one cell or multi-cells. So human beings, we have heart cells, brain cells, finger cells, toe cells, stomach cells, and none of them can live by themselves. We are multicellular because all of our cells work together to be one organism. But there are organisms that either have a little nucleus or not, where all their genetic material is stored. Either way, there are organisms out there that are a single cell. They live completely on their own. They are just like a unicycle, being one wheel. They are unicellular, being one cell. That's code breaker 1. We need to look at the cell, the what type of cell structure organisms have. Then, before we do any other classification, we need to figure out if cells are prokaryotic or eukaryotic. We don't need to memorize that for classification. We just need to know that there's a difference. Humans have cells, 1,000,000,000,000 cells that make up our whole body, and every single one of them has, well, first of all, the nucleus, which has all the genetic material nicely stored, as well as all of these other organelles inside, and they all have like envelopes. Everything is nicely organized, including the nucleus. A eukaryote, or a true organism, must have all the organelles organized with envelopes, which is considered a more evolved life form. But originally, cells just had all the DNA and genetic material just floating around in the cell, like a protocell, except it's called a prokaryote. Now, we don't need to memorize this. We just need to understand that there is a difference, because you can be a multicellular eukaryotic organism, you can be a unicellular eukaryotic organism, or you can be a unicellular prokaryotic organism. It all depends on how everything gets sorted out in the different kingdoms. And finally, whenever we're looking at organisms, we need to be a code breaker and figure out how do they eat? What is their trophic level? Their trophic level depends on, or shows whether or not they're heterotrophic, have to eat other things, or autotrophic. So if I'm a plant, I've got it made in the shade because not only can I photosynthesis, which is the planet's most important chemical reaction because it's the only reaction that takes energy from the sun and changes it into matter, which in this case is sugar that the plant eats and that we eat, but also photosynthesizes to give us oxygen, which we need, and then they breathe in the carbon dioxide. So plants are incredible and we need them all because I like to breathe. Plants and some algae are the only organisms that can make their own food. They automatically make their own food. But heterotrophs, no matter how much you try, no matter how much you lay out in the sun, you cannot photosynthesize. You cannot make your own food. Doesn't matter if you grow the plants yourself, you still have to eat them to survive. Hetero means other. Heterotroph means eating other things. Heterotrophs, like this bear, is eating another organism, has to survive by eating other organisms. So let's use those 3 codebreaker rules to review how we go through each kingdom. Remember, your codebreaker box will be the same for every kingdom, and we're going to practice using our code breaking skills to summarize within our sentence, and then we'll click off that we reviewed uh, that kingdom. There are 6 kingdoms. The review goes fast because remember we spent time on it before. Animal kingdom, don't forget, a tremendous diversity represented within the animal kingdom. And if you want to be in kingdom Animalia, you need to be multicellular. Every single one of those cells needs to have a nucleus. And no matter how much you try, you cannot be autotroph. You have to be a heterotroph. You must eat other organisms, which makes you a consumer of plants and animals. So let's practice our summary statement. Animals are multicellular, eukaryotic, heterotrophs, which cannot make their own energy, so have to eat other organisms. Most have the ability to move from one place to another. Boom, we have checked off that we have reviewed the animal kingdom. Let's proceed. Don't forget we've already reviewed all of the other fun facts, etc. in detail before. All right, plant kingdom. If you want to be in a plant kingdom, you also have to be multicellular. You cannot be unicellular if you want to be in the plant kingdom. So not only are you multicellular and you have eukaryotic cells, which means all your DNA is nicely stored in a nucleus, but you also have cell walls because plants don't have bones. Cell walls are kind of like bones or skeletons for the plant so they can stand up nice and tall. And lucky you, if you want to be in the plant kingdom and you are an autotroph, you are allowed in because you are a producer. You can make your own food from photosynthesis. Let's practice our summary. Plants are multicellular, made up of more than one cell, eukaryotic, cells that have DNA organized in a nucleus, autotrophic, living organisms, with cell walls that photosynthesize to make their own food, which we eat and also get our energy from. And don't forget the fun fact that just about every single fruit or vegetable you eat used to be a flower. All right, let's check off that and continue. All right, fungus, what I like to call the funky kingdom. Not only is it funky in that it's, to me, a little unusual because it's got yeast and so many different kinds of mushrooms and, of course, mold inside of cheese. There's good forms of fungus and bad forms of fungus, but it doesn't matter if you want to be unicellular or multicellular. There might be a space for you in this kingdom. However, you must have eukaryotic cells. You must have a nucleus, and some have cell walls. And you've got to eat other organisms, especially helping the ecosystems out by decomposing dead organisms, breaking down dead organisms. Different kinds of fungi recycle nutrients by decomposing dead organisms. Okay, so fungus is funky because there's a lot of different ways that humans use it, and there's a lot of different ways it exists in nature. I don't know why that keeps popping up, sorry. All right, fungus is done. Protista or protist, algae, seaweed, slime mold, etc. Every single one of these is its own living organism, living on its own. If you go outside and collect some pond water and look at it under your kid's microscope at home, you might be able to see a lot of these critters floating around. Same thing with the ancient kelp forests and other types of algae. So unicellular is the name of the game when it comes to protista, because you have to be made up of one cell. Now those cells, though, all have a nucleus. This is what makes you different than bacteria, which we'll get to in just a moment. However, some heterotrophs are consumers and some are producers. There's no set rule on that. Some behave more like animals, some behave more like plants. Let's practice our summary. Protists are unicellular, eukaryotic organisms. Some protists, like amoeba, are like animals, and others, like chlorella, are like plants and photosynthesize to convert sugar from solar energy. And then, yeah, so we've checked off on protists. Don't forget, we already looked at the fun facts. Now remember, eubacteria and archaeobacteria are two kingdoms that have the name bacteria in there. And I cannot change that for you. But what I can do is teach you that EU is a prefix that means true. So when you think about eubacteria, it is referred to as the true bacteria kingdom. Contains a lot of different types of bacteria that humans have a very interesting relationship with. Not all strep is bad. Not all strep is good. Not all E. coli is bad. Not all E. coli is good, etc. So we have a relationship with unicellular, and this is the thing, prokaryotic organisms that both help us and harm us. Every single one of these is its own organism, but there's no nucleus. It's a more primitive version of life that existed before the nucleus evolved. And you'll learn a lot about that in 7th grade. So you can only see them in a microscope. Some bacteria are like consumers and are heterotroph. Some bacteria are like our producers and are like autotrophs. It can be both. It depends. Now I don't know a lot about autotrophic bacteria, so I know that the general rule is only organisms from plants and some of those algae can photosynthesize, but there are other ways for organisms to make food that are not just from photosynthesis. So maybe this part can kind of be wiggled out from now. Excuse me. Or at least the photosynthesis part. Okay, so let's practice our summary. Bacteria are unicellular. Eubacteria are unicellular, prokaryotic organisms that decompose dead organisms and release energy into the ecosystem. Some strains, or what we also call species, are harmful and some are helpful. We have a symbiotic relationship. We're going to learn about that in a couple of weeks, where we basically have a win-win relationship with bacteria that we must have in our tummy as to help us digest food. That's why we have to eat yogurt, even if you don't like it. Now let's compare the eubacteria with archaea or archaeobacteria. Archaeology is the study of really old stuff, so it's the same with archaeobacteria. Archaeobacteria are, even though they're relatively recently discovered, they're some of the most ancient life forms on the planet. How else could life have formed if they didn't love extreme environments? Extremely hot things like hot pools or hot thermal pools like the ones in Yellowstone National Park, acid, highly acidic bodies of water, or salty, super, super, super salty, like Great Salt Lake types of water. These are places where life lives, believe it or not. They are unicellular and they're prokaryotic, so they don't have a nucleus because they're some of the most primitive versions of life on the planet, but they love those extreme environments. They have a cell wall and they can make their own food even if it's not from photosynthesis. It depends on the organism. They weren't discovered until 1970, and it really wasn't until about 2004-ish that the scientific community worked together to create its own kingdom based on how different they were than regular eubacteria. They live in hot or salty water and are called extremophiles because they love extreme environments. And don't forget that we would not have modern biotechnology today because of the use of these extreme organisms to help us out with some important lab procedures like PCR in the lab. All right, so we've gone through the 6 kingdoms. We've identified that we are in Kingdom Animalia. We've compared the fact that we are one of over 1 million species compared to 5,000 species in bacteria, which has its own domain. Archaea, having 200 or so species, also has its own domain. But now we have, since we have 6 kingdoms now, it used to just be 5, now we have the eukaryota, the true organisms that are not bacteria in nature, combined under this domain: Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. So you couldn't be in Protist kingdom if you wanted to be because you're multicellular. You couldn't be in the plant kingdom if you wanted to be because you don't have cell walls. You don't photosynthesize. You couldn't be in bacteria or archaeobacteria because you are eukaryotic and those are prokaryotic. So all of these differences, code breakers, is what makes you Kingdom Animalia. Okay, so go ahead and complete this matching with me, and then you'll move on to your assessment. So let's see here. Let's put the cougar, whatever that is, with the Animalia. I like to use the eubacteria as the example from the symbiotic, the helpful bacteria that we have in our body that we must have as the example for eubacteria, but there are other examples. The fungus gets paired here with mushrooms. Plants are fairly obvious in Plantae or plant. Protista. Every single one of those is its own organism. They can move around on their own. They can reproduce on their own. Really, really interesting organisms. So unicellular protists. And of course, usually you'll see the Yellowstone thermal pools as the example of where to find extreme life forms like archaeobacteria. All right, at this time, you will complete the check for understanding. Oh yeah, there's a couple of videos. There's some helpful, you're gonna have to watch this through the end. Then you can look at the vocabulary and answer the check for understanding questions at the end. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to hearing what you think. Bye-bye.